I'm heading back now from doing some snagging work at a couple of alcoves that we fitted out around about a year and a half ago, I think. And I wanted to talk to you about a few things that came up from it. This project was fitted just around the point when we were getting into spray painting, but we hadn't moved from the Leyland and Johnston's decorator type products to the Movac products that we now use. So we'd started spraying the products we used to hand paint, and we were just starting to realise we could probably do better in terms of spray paint. So it was interesting for me to go back and see it. Also, it was the 5-piece door style that we've always used up until we started experimenting with CNC. So just quite interesting to compare the level of finish to what we now get. The issue that we were called back for was cracking cork joints around the countertops. And this is an issue that has bugged me for a while because I've been aware that it sometimes happens, and I've done everything I could think of to prevent it, and in fact I don't remember if on this particular job I was yet doing what I now do, which is when I've cut the edge of something, I'm talking about MDF, pre-painted MDF, I've taken to rubbing the cork by hand into the cut edge after getting the dust off, to try and get it to bond to the MDF edge. Because I have noticed before when I've been back to jobs, perhaps to quote for another project, sometimes the scribes, particularly the vertical scribes I usually find on classic bookcases, there's just a hairline crack that opens up, and it's always on the MDF side. It will always bond to the wall but not the MDF, which I guess isn't surprising. So I've experimented over the years with different types of cork, different methods, trying to sand the edge smoother. In summary, the solution is to prime that edge, but I've just always wanted to avoid it because it would often be the difference between getting the job fitted in a day and having to wait, because often it's the very end of the day that I'm fitting those final scribes, and if I've got to trim them to fit, then sand them, prime them, let the primer dry, then fit them and cork them. It's just that extra bit of time that I've wanted to avoid. So what I have experimented with is the best types of cork. So I'm looking for the whitest ones and the most flexible ones and the most sticky ones, and having tried loads, I settled on Cork Once, Everbuild's Cork Once. It has a lot of body to it, it's flexible, it dries very quick, it stays fairly white. However, on that point, it's generally best, well, it's always best not to leave a cork line unpainted, because it will always yellow a little bit, and it's like a magnet for dust and grime. So it's one of those areas where it's very, very tempting as a fitter to leave something that looks just spot on when you leave, but will not look spot on at all in a few weeks, let alone months or years. And I think there's a lot of tradesmen out there that do that happily just walk away from something that will end up looking a lot shoddier. But I've always wanted to avoid that, so I try to paint those cork lines. But since spraying, that brings up a whole other set of issues, because when the finish was hand painted, I'd be hand painting up to those edges over the cork, blending it all in. But when you've got a sprayed finish, it's a toss-up between, do I want a fine cork line that might slightly discolour, or do I want an over-painted cork line where there's brush marks visible all around the edge against this pristine sprayed finish? So it's a bit of an open debate in my head, and lately I've leant more towards getting those cork joints as tight as possible, and making sure that the cork I fill with I smooth completely off the surface and just have the finest line. And that's definitely what I do lately on chunky shelves. And yeah, I'm a little on the fence really with countertops and things like that. So back to different types of cork. We tried loads, we settled on Cork Once. Along the way we tried a product called Kota with a K, K-O-T-A. This is something that I discovered being sold at Arnold Lavers, who's one of our suppliers. It's a whole system where you can buy pre-finished skirting boards and architraves, which come with a dedicated adhesive because the finish on them, it feels almost like a plastic wrap, almost like it's dipped or something. I think it is effectively sprayed, but it's quite tough and plasticky. It has a sort of satin sheen, just in white. And so you get a special adhesive, so you just stick them to the wall, and you get a special cork filler. I think it's just called Coater Fill. And the idea of that is that it stays white, and it's the exact shade of white as the skirting. You also get a wax filler, so if you decide if you need to pin it on, you use the wax filler, and again, that's meant to be a perfect match. Now, I messed around with those for a while. When I used to do sort of general skirting and architraves, I thought, what a brilliant idea, fully pre-finished. But I went a little bit off it, because I don't think you ever can really fill the hole perfectly to colour. And it's a similar issue to when you've got two different whites in materials. So say on wardrobes, say you've got a white melamine in the carcass and a white vinyl wrap for the doors, they never perfectly match, and they tend to just change colour slightly over time, and a few years down the line look very shoddy in my opinion. So I'm getting a bit off track, but for wardrobes, I would always overclad everything in the same material and the same colour, whether it's painted or vinyl wrap. And then I might have a carcass inside that might be slightly different, but I would never have your exposed melamine carcass as a side panel and then the vinyl wrap on front, because to me it just looks that bit cheaper. So getting back to the Coater products, clever idea, but I kind of gave up on them. I did keep using the fill for a while, because I thought finally I found a cork filler that is designed to stay white, so I can get around this whole overpainting issue. However, it seems to be a particularly brittle filler. It really doesn't have much flexibility, and in fact when you put it on it feels a little bit gritty. And to be honest, it seemed to discolour a little bit as well anyway, so that was really a bit of a failure, and more expensive. I think it was something like £4 a tube, whereas for the Cork Once, the other benefit of it is very reasonably priced. It's certainly under £2. I think maybe £1, £1.50 we're paying at the moment per tube. So the other product which I've been aware of is CT1, the all-purpose sealant and filler, and it's sort of somewhere between a silicone, a cork and an adhesive. It bonds to anything, it's waterproof, but unlike silicone, it's not really shiny. It goes to a slightly duller finish. And I've heard of people using it for the purposes that we would need it, but it's very expensive, about £8 to £10 a tube. It is overpaintable, so that's the other great thing about it, and it's very flexible. It bonds to anything, it's very flexible. I never really used it because I wasn't sure if it was worth it. However, for this project that I was just called back on, where there were cracks opening up, I thought, right, let's give it a try. So I went and got some CT1 in the white, and I raked out the old cork, the dry cork, and hoovered it out, which took a bit of time with a Stanley knife and a chisel, and then filled with CT1, and it went on quite nicely. It sort of felt like silicone. It wiped off with Wonder Wipes, and I was able to use the little those little rubber things. If you're not aware of them, they're on sale at Toolstation, and they're great for getting a good cork line. You have a profiled edge and a sort of two flat scraping sides. It's just a little square thing, and you can just scrape off and get a great cork line. So I used all those things, and it looks good. Something I noticed on the job, going back to it now after a year and a half or so, was there was quite a lot of discoloration around the edges of things, and it seemed to be where I must have corked before, but I'm pretty sure I would have overpainted that cork, and it just seemed like if there was cork underneath what would have been a thin final layer of paint, it just seemed very prone to discoloration, which is perhaps an argument for avoiding corking and overpainting as much as possible and just keeping that join as thin as possible. But of course this was the old paint, the old decorator's paint, which I have noticed is a bit prone to staining. So if you got coffee or something like that on it, it can tend to get brownish stains that seem to go into it and will not rub off. So I'm glad we've moved away from that paint, but I don't think we've fully resolved the perfect cork line question. Now, I raised this on the Festool Facebook group, Festool Talk group, called Festdrool, which is worth checking out if you're into this sort of work. And some people, including Peter Millard, recommended a Dunlop filler, which I've not really seen anywhere, but I want to give it a try. However, the main takeaway from the discussions there was you're never really going to avoid that cracking risk until you prime the edges before corking them. And that leads on to a bigger discussion, which I'm going to get onto in a minute. But first, I just wanted to say another interesting thing about this project I've just gone back to was it was the first fitted alcove job that. Well, it was the job that made us decide to move away from using MDF for the base cabinets and standardise using birch plywood, because the doors were pulling off, the screw fixings were pulling out of the MDF. It was just Medite Premier MDF, and I just decided, right, it doesn't have enough holding power for screws. And because we often don't paint the internal cabinets, although we offer that as an option, we don't tend to use the MR MDF in the base cabinets because it's green and it looks a bit funny. So we decided, right, we're just going to upgrade to birch plywood across the board for any internal cabinet that needs to receive doors. So that's a side note, really. So the bigger discussion that this is raising, so there's a few things going on where I'm realising the risks involved in fitted work, and we try to do a good job, but I've talked before about the need to compromise, because you want to do a good job, but you want to make a living. You've got to get the job done in a certain time frame for it to be profitable. And apart from these sort of nagging concerns about the quality of cork joints and stuff like that, I had a project a couple of weeks back where we had fitted an alcove for this customer a few years ago. They didn't want both sides fitted at the time, but they came back to us just recently and said, well, can we match up on the other side? And our methods in the meantime had changed, but I went and measured the way we had done it before and tried to match it all up. But I must admit, was a bit distracted when I went to fit the thing, because my wife was in hospital with just a minor thing, and everything's fine now. But you've always got things going on in your life, and sometimes you're not as on the ball as you perhaps could be. So I fitted the cupboard and the shelves, and I worked off the dimensions on the drawing, which had been based on the survey of the previous job. And I think we referred to the original CAD drawing, which we still had. But one way or another, we had dimensions on the drawing for where I should fit the shelves, and as I normally do, I just went straight in and fitted them. And I did stand back and eye it across to the other alcove and thought, yeah, that's in line. However, I didn't laser level it, which I should have done. But I thought it looks in line to me, and there wasn't a picture rail running across to visually give you a precise reference point. Well, in short, it was all done and looked great, and the customer was very happy, but then rang us up the next day and said they'd been sat on their sofa looking at it that evening and realised things weren't quite in line, and then got out the spirit level and the tape measure, and things are a little bit off, like a centimetre or so, and they're just not happy with it. And fair enough, they called me in to do the job because I'd done the original job and they wanted it to match perfectly. So I'm obliged really to rip it out and replace it. I feel that's probably the only real solution, because I value this customer's, well, I want this customer to be happy, and I also know that they have been recommending us. And so all this stuff kicked off me thinking, is this all really worth it? Am I just kidding myself that I'm gonna scale this thing? Because I think the whole fitted furniture model is very, very difficult to scale. And I'm just starting to think, no, it's not really going to work. So my thinking is I go back to a smaller team where I have the continuity from design through manufacture to fitting, because I've been stepping back hoping this is the way to grow, to delegate stuff, but it means that sometimes my head's out of a job, and also I've got the burden of communication to say, well, this is the idea in my head, hand it over to be detailed, then hand it over to be made, and there's so much room for error and miscommunication, and also huge time drains where if you just have it in your head and you make it, then you can crack on. But if you're trying to set up to have a team that are part of that process, you've got to spend so much time communicating, and every job's different. So I have become quite discouraged with my grand plan of systemizing and scaling the whole thing, and I'm starting to think it makes a lot more sense just to focus on systemizing to the point where a small team, me, an apprentice, and maybe one or two others, just do it as well and as efficiently as we can, and I keep that control. And then rather than getting loads more staff in, maybe I sort of teach others in these methods to the extent that it's helpful to others, and sort of scale the investment in that way, rather than taking on the growth of a business to be managing loads of other people. So that's the way my thinking's going, and alongside that I'm looking at getting into freestanding pieces, bespoke made things, that a line of fairly unusual furniture you can't just pick up at IKEA, but that has enough popularity that it could be designed once, tested, and then made, just repeated, which would cut out so much of the headache of everything being designed from scratch and having to be installed. Because I'm finding it very hard to hand over the installation. When I have tried, it's only caused more headaches. So I'm exploring some other avenues without by any means quitting what we do, and just seeing if we can make that work. So there's a little update for anybody that's interested. If you found this video by googling for advice on caulking or whatever, you've probably switched off by now, but that's fine. And I'm almost at my destination, which is a place that may be selling off a cheap CNC machine and possibly a spray booth, so I'm just going to go check that out, and I'll sign off for now.